The morning of May 24th, 1944, darkness still clung to the waters north of the Admiralty Islands when Soundman John Prock pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. Through the steel hull of the USS England, through hundreds of feet of black Pacific water, he could hear it, the faint, rhythmic thrum of a submarine's propellers. RO-116, a Japanese submarine, was down there somewhere, twisting and turning, trying desperately to escape. But Prock had something the enemy didn't expect, a trick that defied every rule in the sonar operator's manual, a technique so counterintuitive that when he'd first suggested it, even his own officers had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Yet, in the next 30 minutes, this 23-year-old soundman from Indiana would prove that sometimes the best way to catch a submarine wasn't to hunt harder. It was to make the submarine think you'd stopped hunting altogether. This is the story of how one sailor's impossible sonar trick turned destroyers into perfect predators in total darkness, and how that innovation helped USS England achieve what no warship before or since has ever matched. To understand the shock of what Prock did, you first have to understand the deadly game being played in the Pacific during May of 1944. The war had turned. American forces were island-hopping their way toward Japan, and the Japanese High Command knew it. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was planning Operation Ago, a desperate gamble to ambush the American fleet in one decisive battle. The plan required advance warning. So on May 20th, 1944, Toyoda ordered 7 submarines of the 7th Submarine Squadron to form a patrol line northeast of the Admiralty Islands and New Guinea. These submarines, RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, and RO-116, would act as early warning pickets, reporting American fleet movements and, if possible, sinking enough battleships to tip the balance before the surface battle even began. It was a sound strategy. There was just one problem. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had intercepted and decoded the orders. Admiral William Halsey knew exactly where the submarine picket line would be, and he knew exactly how to respond. He ordered 3 destroyer escorts, USS England, USS George, and USS Raby, to roll up that picket line from one end to the other, not to avoid the submarines, to hunt them, to erase them. The destroyer escorts were small ships, a fraction of the size of fleet destroyers. USS England displaced 1,400 tons and carried a crew of just 186 men. She mounted 3 3-inch guns instead of the 5-inch batteries of larger warships, but she bristled with submarine-killing weapons. 8 K-guns that could hurl depth charges 150 yards, 2 racks that rolled charges off her stern, and most importantly, a British-designed Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, 24 projectiles that fired ahead of the ship, allowing sonar contact to be maintained throughout the attack. Unlike conventional depth charges that exploded at preset depths, Hedgehog grenades only detonated when they struck something solid, like a submarine's pressure hull. This meant no massive underwater explosions disrupting sonar, no blind firing at where you hoped the target might be, just precision strikes guided by sound all the way to impact. The England had been commissioned on December 10th, 1943. She'd arrived in the South Pacific in March of 1944 and had spent 2 months on routine escort duty. Her crew had trained relentlessly, but they'd never fired a shot in anger. They were untested. Green. And now, they were being sent to hunt the most experienced submarine force in the Pacific. The England's commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, a career Navy man who practiced an unusual hands-off style of command. He recognized that his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, possessed both tactical brilliance and combat experience. Williamson had served on destroyers during the Battle of the Atlantic, witnessing firsthand the carnage German U-boats inflicted on Allied convoys. He'd trained sonar operators at the Subchaser School in Miami. He understood submarine warfare at a molecular level, and Williamson understood his sonar team. The soundmen aboard England weren't just equipment operators. They were artists. They had to distinguish submarine echoes from the countless false contacts that plagued sonar. Schools of fish, thermal layers, wrecks, even the wakes of other ships. It required a musical ear, the ability to hear pitch shifts in returning echoes that revealed whether a target was approaching or moving away. The ability to recognize the specific acoustic signature of propellers against the ambient noise of the ocean. The team's lead soundman was John Prock. His junior was Roger Bernhardt, who'd made the England's first submarine contact just days earlier. Together, they formed the ship's ears. In darkness, in rough seas, in conditions where human eyes were useless, they could hear what no one else could hear. They could track targets that existed only as patterns of sound bouncing through cold water. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On May 19th, the 3 destroyer escorts had found their first target, I-16, a large fleet submarine carrying supplies to Japanese troops. It had taken 5 attack runs, but England had finally gotten solid hedgehog hits. The submarine had exploded with such violence that it lifted England's fantail clear of the water. 1 down. On May 22nd, at 3:50 in the morning, USS George had detected RO-106 on radar while the submarine was surfaced, charging batteries. The submarine dove, but England regained sonar contact. 2 hedgehog attacks, 3 to 5 direct hits, debris and oil rising to the surface at dawn. 2 down. On May 23rd, the 3 ships had found RO-104. This submarine's commander was skilled, conducting radical evasive maneuvers that caused USS Raby to miss with 4 consecutive hedgehog attacks. The submarine even attempted to jam Raby's sonar with bursts of tuned sound impulses, but England's sonar team maintained contact through the countermeasures. Their attack scored direct hits. 3 down. By May 24th, word had spread through the small destroyer escort community. England was on a killing streak. Her crew was functioning with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, but tonight would test them like nothing before. Because RO-116's commander, Oberleutnant Zur Seimasagi Okabe, was not going down easy. Okabe was a veteran, skilled and cunning. When George's radar detected his submarine on the surface at 1:20 in the morning, RO-116 dove immediately and began executing textbook evasion tactics. He kicked his rudder into aggressive fishtail maneuvers that disrupted American sonar. He conducted rapid depth changes, diving deep, then suddenly rising to confuse range calculations. He even counterpinged, using his own active sonar to create acoustic confusion. England gained sonar contact at 1:50. Lieutenant Williamson maneuvered the ship for a hedgehog attack, but as they closed, Okabe's tactics paid off. The contact became intermittent, fuzzy. The submarine was slipping away into the darkness. The bridge called down to the sonar station. They needed a solution. They needed it now. John Prock studied his instruments. He could still hear the submarine, faintly, through the hydrophones. But the active sonar pings weren't getting clean returns. Every time they pinged, the submarine seemed to know exactly where they were, seemed to anticipate their movements. That's when Prock realized something. Standard doctrine called for increasing the rate of sonar pulses during an attack run. More pings meant more data, better tracking, higher accuracy. Every submarine commander knew this. They'd been trained to expect it. They listened for that increasing ping rate because it told them an attack was imminent. What if, Prock thought, we did the opposite? What if we made the submarine commander think we'd lost contact? What if we made him think he was safe? Prock made his way to the bridge. Lieutenant Williamson was there coordinating the attack. Prock explained his idea. On the next attack run, instead of increasing the sonar pulse rate, they would decrease it. They would make it seem like England was losing contact, searching randomly. The submarine commander, thinking he'd successfully evaded, might relax, might hold a steady course just long enough for one perfect hedgehog throw. Williamson looked at the young soundman. It was insane. It violated every principle of active sonar tracking. You needed continuous data to maintain a firing solution. Decreasing ping rate meant larger gaps in your information. More uncertainty, higher chance of missing. But Williamson had learned to trust his sonar operators. They'd been right before. "All right," Williamson said. "We'll try it your way." England came around for another run. Down in the sonar station, Prock put on his headphones. He sent out a ping. Listened. There. A faint echo bearing 205 degrees. He waited. Sent another ping. Slower than before. The submarine was still there. Still maneuvering. In the submarine, Okabe heard the American sonar. But the pattern was different now. The pings were coming slower. More irregular. The Americans were losing him. He'd done it. He'd broken contact. But he couldn't run on batteries forever. And he couldn't risk another radar detection by surfacing. He needed to put distance between himself and the Americans, then go deep and hide beneath a thermal layer. He steadied his course just for a moment to check his gyro compass heading. That moment was all England needed. At 2:14 in the morning, Lieutenant Williamson gave the order. Fire Hedgehog. 24 projectiles arced into darkness, splashing into the black Pacific in an elliptical pattern. They sank rapidly toward the submarine's last projected position. Aboard England, the crew waited in silence. No one breathed. Then they heard it. 3 explosions. 4, 5 distinct detonations. The unmistakable sound of contact-fused projectiles striking a steel hull. Breaking up noises followed. Not the massive explosion they'd heard on previous kills, just the terrible sounds of a submarine dying, bulkheads collapsing, machinery tearing loose, pressure hull plates buckling under the crushing weight of the ocean. RO-116 and her crew of 56 men dropped into the abyss. At 7:02, as dawn broke, a small patch of oil and debris confirmed the kill. By the following day, the oil slick had expanded to cover several square miles. 4 down. But England wasn't finished. On May 26th, as the 3 destroyer escorts were heading back to Manus to resupply, USS Raby detected RO-108 on radar. The submarine dove. Once again, England's sonar team made contact. Once again, John Prock was at the sound tower, his headphones on, his fingers steady on the controls. This time, there was no need for tricks. The sonar team had found their rhythm. They'd become extensions of the machine. Or perhaps the machine had become an extension of them. Lieutenant Williamson maneuvered England into position. At 23:23 hours, he fired exactly half the Hedgehogs remaining on board, the other half having been expended on previous attacks. Prock maintained perfect tracking. The projectiles struck true. A series of muffled blasts from 250 feet down signaled the destruction of RO-108 and her 58 crew members. 5 down. After resupplying and rearming at Manus, the 3 destroyer escorts rejoined the hunt. USS Spangler, another destroyer escort, joined them. On May 30th, they found RO-105. This submarine was perhaps the most difficult target yet. Her commander executed brilliant evasive maneuvers. When USS George made contact and attacked with Hedgehogs, the submarine dodged. USS Raby attacked. The submarine dodged again. USS Spangler attacked. Still, the submarine survived, twisting and turning through the dark water like a ghost. By dawn, on May 31st, the submarine was still alive, still fighting. USS Hazelwood, a Fletcher-class destroyer, gained sonar contact and dropped depth charges. No effect. George made several more Hedgehog attacks, possibly scoring 3 hits. Yet, still the submarine kept maneuvering. As the sun rose, both Spangler and England joined the attack. Spangler attacked with Hedgehogs and missed. Commander Hamilton Haynes, the tactical commander aboard George, had seen enough. He radioed, "Oh hell, go ahead, England." At 0736, England fired her Hedgehogs, 6 to 10 detonations. A massive underwater explosion at 0741. Oil and debris erupted to the surface. RO-105 and her 55 crew members were gone. 6 submarines in 12 days. It was a record that had never been achieved before in naval warfare. It's a record that stands to this day. The British 2nd Escort Group, centered on HMS Starling and led by the legendary Commander Frederick Walker, had sunk 6 U-boats in 19 days during February 1944. That was considered the gold standard of anti-submarine warfare. England had done it in 12 days. But the real revolution wasn't the kill count. It was how those kills had been achieved. John Prock's counterintuitive sonar tactic, decreasing ping rate to deceive the enemy, represented a fundamental shift in submarine hunting. For decades, active sonar doctrine had focused on maximizing information, more pings, more data, better tracking. Prock proved that sometimes less information, used strategically, was more deadly than perfect information used predictably. His technique exploited submarine commanders' training against them. They'd been taught to listen for increasing ping rates as a warning of imminent attack when that warning didn't come. When the pings slowed or stopped, they assumed they'd successfully evaded. That assumption, that moment of relaxation, that single instant when they steadied course to reorient, was when hedgehog projectiles would rain down from above. The technique required extraordinary skill from sonar operators. They had to maintain tracking with minimal data. They had to visualize the submarine's probable position using sparse echoes and intuition developed through hundreds of training hours. They had to trust their ears more than their instruments. John Prock and his fellow soundmen aboard England had that skill. They'd honed it through obsessive training during the ship's workup period. The England had earned a reputation as a taut ship, not because of harsh discipline, but because of the crew's collective commitment to excellence. Every system was maintained at peak performance. Every watchstander knew his job perfectly. The ship functioned as a single organism, with sonar operators as its sensory system, hedgehog gunners as its weapons, and the engineering gang as its heart, delivering precisely calibrated speed changes that kept the ship positioned for perfect attacks. Lieutenant Williamson's role was crucial. As executive officer, he understood that his job wasn't to micromanage, but to create conditions where talented sailors could innovate. When Prock suggested his unconventional tactic, Williamson didn't dismiss it. He listened, he evaluated, he gave permission to try something that violated doctrine. That willingness to embrace innovation, that trust between officer and enlisted man, was what made England so deadly. The technical challenges of what England accomplished are difficult to overstate. Sonar in 1944 was primitive by modern standards. The active system sent out a directional sound beam that bounced off submerged objects. The operator listened for echoes through headphones, watching a cathode ray tube display that showed range as a flickering light. The beam was narrow, only about 5 degrees wide, which meant operators had to sweep back and forth, stopping regularly to listen for returns. Water conditions affected everything. Temperature layers, thermoclines, could refract sound waves, creating dead zones where submarines could hide. Rough seas created noise that masked submarine echoes. The ship's own machinery, her propellers, even water flowing past her hull, created acoustic interference that had to be filtered out mentally by the operator. False contacts were constant. Schools of fish, whale sounds, the deep, scattering layer, a phenomenon where millions of small creatures with air-filled swim bladders reflected sonar like a phantom submarine. Wrecks on the seafloor, even the wakes of other ships, could create echoes that resembled submarines. Experienced operators learned to distinguish these false contacts from genuine targets. They listened for specific acoustic signatures, the characteristic thrum of propellers, the sounds of machinery, the distinct pitch shift that occurred when sound bounced off a moving object. This Doppler effect was crucial. When a submarine moved toward the destroyer, returning echoes had a higher pitch than outgoing pulses. When it moved away, the pitch dropped. Operators who could detect these subtle shifts could determine not just where a submarine was, but where it was going. The greatest limitation of active sonar was that it required the ship to be moving slowly, typically 10 knots or less, to minimize self-generated noise. At higher speeds, the rushing water and propeller cavitation drowned out everything. This created a fundamental vulnerability. Destroyers and destroyer escorts were faster than submarines on the surface, but when hunting a submerged target, they had to slow down to use sonar effectively. If they slowed too much, a desperate submarine commander might decide to surface and fight it out with deck guns. Too fast, and sonar became useless. The Hedgehog weapon system solved another critical problem. Traditional depth charges were rolled off the stern or thrown to the sides by K-guns. They exploded at preset depths, creating massive underwater shock waves. These explosions temporarily blinded sonar, creating a gap of several minutes when the destroyer had no idea if the submarine had been hit or had escaped. Submarine commanders exploited this gap, executing radical maneuvers the instant they heard depth charges detonating. By the time the destroyer's sonar came back online, the submarine might be hundreds of yards from its last known position. Hedgehog fired projectiles ahead of the ship while sonar contact was still solid. The projectiles sank quickly, much faster than depth charges, and only exploded on contact with a hard surface. If they missed, they didn't explode at all, just sank to the seafloor without disturbing the water. This meant the sonar operator never lost contact. If the submarine tried to maneuver after the projectiles were fired, the operator could track that maneuver and feed corrections to the attack team for the next run. It was this continuous tracking capability that made England's kill rate so extraordinary. But technology alone didn't win battles. The human element mattered more. John Prock wasn't just operating equipment. He was engaged in psychological warfare with submarine commanders he never saw. He was listening to the ocean, interpreting its sounds, making split-second decisions based on incomplete information. When he suggested decreasing ping rate to deceive RO-116, he was thinking like a submarine commander. He was imagining what Okabe was hearing, what Okabe was thinking, what Okabe would do in response. He was turning the submarine commander's training into a trap. This kind of tactical innovation couldn't be programmed into machines or written into manuals. It emerged from experience, from deep understanding of both the technology and the enemy. It required what military theorists call tactical empathy, the ability to see the battle from your opponent's perspective. Prock had developed this through countless training exercises, learning not just how to operate sonar, but how submarine commanders thought, how they reacted, what sounds they listened for, what patterns betrayed Allied intentions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese submarine force in the Pacific during 1944 was sophisticated and experienced. Many commanders had been at war since 1941. They'd developed effective countermeasures against American anti-submarine tactics. They knew to execute radical maneuvers, fishtails, rapid depth changes, course reversals, to break sonar contact. They knew to hide beneath thermal layers where temperature gradients refracted sound waves. Some even had rudimentary radar detectors that could warn them when American ships were searching. But they couldn't counter what they didn't expect. When RO-116's commander heard England's sonar pings slowing, becoming irregular, he interpreted it according to his training. The Americans were losing contact. His evasion was working. This interpretation was reasonable, even logical. It was also fatal, because it caused him to do exactly what John Prock predicted he would do: steady his course for just one moment, just long enough. The impact of England's 12-day patrol extended far beyond 6 sunken submarines. The Japanese submarine picket line was annihilated before it could report a single piece of useful intelligence. Admiral Toyoda's Operation Ago proceeded without the early warning he'd counted on. When the American fleet struck at the Mariana Islands in mid-June, the Japanese were caught off balance. The resulting Battle of the Philippine Sea, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, became a catastrophic defeat for Japanese naval aviation. Without those submarine scouts, Japanese commanders didn't know the American fleet's composition, course, or timing. The decisive battle Toyoda had planned became a massacre. 3. Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Over 600 aircraft were destroyed. Japan's naval air power, already diminished by years of attrition, was effectively broken. The submarines that might have prevented this disaster lay on the Pacific floor, victims of a destroyer escort that shouldn't have been that deadly, guided by a sonar operator who'd figured out how to turn silence into a weapon. The tactical innovation that John Prock pioneered didn't remain secret for long. Within weeks, other destroyer escorts in the Pacific were being briefed on England's techniques. The Office of the Chief of Naval Operations issued bulletins analyzing the patrol, distributing lessons learned to anti-submarine warfare schools in Miami, San Diego, and Pearl Harbor. Sonar operators across the fleet began experimenting with variable ping rates, with deliberate deception tactics, with psychological manipulation of submarine commanders. But replicating England's success proved difficult. The technique required more than just understanding the theory. It demanded extraordinary sonar operators who could maintain tracking with minimal data. It required commanding officers willing to trust enlisted men's tactical judgment. It required crews drilled to perfection, where every station functioned flawlessly under pressure. Most importantly, it required opponents who hadn't yet learned the counter-counter tactic. By late 1944, Japanese submarine commanders had been briefed about England's methods. They learned to be suspicious of slowing ping rates to maintain evasion even when sonar contact seemed to fade. The tactical advantage, like all advantages in warfare, was temporary, but it had been exploited at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right results. After England's extraordinary patrol, Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, made a promise that resonated through naval history. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. It was more than just a tribute to the ship and her crew. It was recognition that England represented something fundamental about American naval warfare, the willingness to innovate, to trust capable sailors regardless of rank, to adapt doctrine when reality demanded it. The promise was kept. When England was eventually decommissioned, a new ship was given her name, USS England, a guided missile cruiser designated DLG-22, commissioned in 1961. That ship served with distinction through the Cold War. When she was decommissioned in 1994, the name passed again, ensuring that Commander King's vow remained fulfilled. But the original England story didn't end with her submarine killing spree. On May 9, 1945, as she was on radar picket duty off Okinawa, 3 Japanese dive bombers attacked the ship. England's gunners shot one down, but the aircraft crashed into her starboard side, its bomb exploding in the forward fire room. 12 men were killed. 20 more were wounded. The ship was so badly damaged that she was sent back to the United States for repairs. She arrived at Philadelphia Navy Yard in July. Then, in August, the war ended. England would never return to combat. She was decommissioned on October 26, 1945, less than 18 months after her commissioning. Her total combat deployment had lasted barely more than a year. In that year, she'd changed naval warfare forever. The destroyer escort herself was sold for scrap in November 1946, but her story lived on in naval doctrine, in training manuals, in the collective memory of the submarine service and the anti-submarine warfare community. John Prock returned to civilian life after the war. He settled back in Indiana, far from the Pacific waters where he'd hunted submarines in darkness. He never sought fame for his contribution. In the military culture of the era, enlisted men didn't write memoirs or give interviews. They did their jobs, achieved extraordinary things, and then went home. The official records recognize Lieutenant Williamson's tactical command and Captain Pendleton's leadership. The ship herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit honors the military can bestow. But buried in after-action reports, in the technical details of sonar tactics, John Prock's name appears. His suggestion, his technique, his willingness to think differently about a problem everyone else had accepted as solved. Lieutenant Williamson, in his later writings about the patrol, gave credit where it was due. He described Prock as a critical member of the team whose innovative thinking turned a difficult tactical problem into a decisive victory. The innovation itself seems simple in retrospect. Vary your ping rate. Deceive the enemy. Make them think you've lost contact. But simplicity is deceptive. The truly innovative ideas often seem obvious after someone has proven they work. Before Prock suggested it, every sonar operator in every navy followed the same doctrine. More pings for more accuracy. It took someone willing to question that doctrine, someone who understood both the technology and the psychology of submarine warfare deeply enough to see the vulnerability created by predictability. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovations that change warfare often come not from high-level strategic planning, but from frontline operators who see problems differently. The fighter pilots who developed boom and zoom tactics, the tank crews who figured out combined arms coordination, the radar operators who learned to distinguish aircraft types by the character of their returns. These weren't academic exercises. They were hard-won lessons, learned under pressure, shared through informal networks, gradually incorporated into official doctrine. The technology that made England's patrol possible had developed rapidly during World War II. At the war's beginning, active sonar was relatively crude. Range was limited, accuracy was poor, false contacts were overwhelming. But by 1944, advances in electronics, in transducer design, in signal processing, had created systems sophisticated enough that skilled operators could track submarines with remarkable precision. The gap between the technology's theoretical capability and its practical performance in combat depended entirely on operator skill. This human-technology interface defined anti-submarine warfare. The machines provided data, echoes, bearing indicators, range measurements, but humans interpreted that data, recognized patterns, made tactical decisions. John Prock's innovation worked because he understood this relationship. He knew the machine's capabilities and limitations intimately. He knew what sounds meant, what patterns revealed, what gaps in data could be filled with experience and intuition. When he suggested decreasing ping rate, he wasn't just manipulating equipment. He was manipulating an enemy commander's perception. He was using technology as a tool of psychological warfare. This understanding that anti-submarine warfare was as much about human psychology as acoustic physics gave American forces a crucial edge. The Japanese submarine commanders were skilled and brave. They knew their boats. They understood sonar, but they'd been trained to interpret sonar pulses in specific ways, and that training became a vulnerability when opponents learned to exploit it. The statistical record of England's patrol tells a story that goes beyond tactical innovation. 6 submarines sunk in 12 days represents approximately 1 submarine every 2 days. Each attack required finding the target, searching thousands of square miles of ocean, tracking the target, maintaining sonar contact through evasive maneuvers, attacking the target, positioning the ship perfectly for hedgehog launch, and killing the target, scoring direct hits with projectiles fired into darkness. The probability of success at each stage was less than 100%. The probability of succeeding at all stages, 6 times in 12 days, with essentially 0 failures, borders on the statistically improbable. Yet it happened. It happened because every link in the chain, from codebreakers who revealed submarine positions, to radar operators who detected surface targets, to sonar operators who maintained tracking, to hedgehog gunners who loaded and fired, to engineers who controlled the ship's speed with precision, to the commanding officers who made split-second tactical decisions, every link performed flawlessly. This is what Admiral King recognized when he promised there would always be an England in the Navy. Not just that one ship had gotten lucky, but that American naval forces, when properly trained, properly equipped, and properly led, could achieve things that seemed impossible. The contrast with Japanese submarine operations during the same period is stark. By May 1944, the Japanese submarine force was already in crisis. Early in the war, they'd achieved remarkable successes, but as American anti-submarine capabilities improved, Japanese submarines found themselves hunted with increasing effectiveness. The submarines of the 7th Submarine Squadron that formed Admiral Toyoda's picket line represented a significant portion of Japan's remaining operational submarine fleet. Losing all 7 in a matter of weeks was catastrophic. But beyond the material losses, the psychological impact was devastating. Japanese submarine commanders who survived other encounters reported that American anti-submarine forces seemed to know where submarines would be before they arrived. That sonar could track through evasive maneuvers that should have broken contact. That depth charges and hedgehogs seemed to strike with impossible accuracy. They were right. The Americans did know where submarines would be. Codebreakers provided that information. Sonar could track through evasive maneuvers because operators like Prock had learned to maintain contact with minimal pings. Hedgehogs did strike with impossible accuracy because the technology enabled continuous tracking right up to impact. But Japanese commanders didn't know about the broken codes. They didn't know about the tactical innovations in sonar operation. From their perspective, it seemed like the Americans had developed some supernatural ability to hunt submarines. This perception created a climate of fear that affected operational effectiveness. Submarine commanders became hesitant, overly cautious. They surfaced less frequently, which meant less battery charging, which reduced their operational radius. They transmitted less, which degraded the command and control network. They took fewer risks, which meant fewer successful attacks on American targets. The psychological dimension of anti-submarine warfare, the mental pressure on submarine crews knowing they were being hunted by forces that seemed omniscient, cannot be overstated. German U-boat crews in the Atlantic experienced the same phenomenon. As Allied anti-submarine capabilities improved through 1943 and 1944, U-boat losses mounted to unsustainable levels. Crews departing on patrol knew the statistical odds of not returning were approaching 50%. The psychological strain was immense. Many experienced commanders were pulled from frontline service due to combat fatigue. Replacement crews were rushed through training, less skilled than veterans, more likely to make fatal mistakes. This created a death spiral, where losses led to lower quality crews, which led to more losses. England's patrol exemplified how this death spiral operated in the Pacific. Each submarine sunk wasn't just a material loss, it was an experienced crew gone, knowledge and expertise eliminated, a gap in the defensive network. The submarines that survived and returned to port carried reports of American capabilities that seemed impossible to counter. This information spread through the submarine force, creating a climate where confidence was replaced by dread. The technological trajectory of anti-submarine warfare during World War II pointed toward a future where submarines would face even more sophisticated detection systems. Sonar continued to improve. By war's end, American destroyers were equipped with sonar that could track submarines at significantly longer ranges than early war equipment. Research into low-frequency sound propagation revealed that certain acoustic signals could travel hundreds of miles through the ocean, enabling long-range submarine detection networks. The development of sonobuoys, expendable listening devices dropped from aircraft, extended aircraft anti-submarine capabilities far beyond visual range. The integration of radar, sonar, and radio direction finding into coordinated search systems made it increasingly difficult for submarines to hide anywhere in the ocean. The Cold War would see this technological race continue. Nuclear submarines that could remain submerged indefinitely rendered many World War II anti-submarine tactics obsolete. But new detection methods, low-frequency, passive sonar arrays, magnetic anomaly detectors, satellite surveillance, emerged to counter them. The fundamental dynamic established during World War II The endless cycle of submarine stealth versus anti-submarine detection continued driving innovation on both sides. But the core principles remained constant. Human operators mattered. Tactical innovation mattered. Understanding both your technology and your opponent's psychology mattered. John Prock's contribution to anti-submarine warfare was recognizing that predictability was a vulnerability. That doctrine, when applied rigidly, created patterns opponents could exploit. That the best way to counter an adaptation was to become unpredictable. These lessons applied far beyond submarine hunting. They're fundamental principles of any competitive endeavor where opponents study each other, where past patterns predict future actions, where innovation disrupts established expectations. Modern military forces still grapple with these issues. How do you maintain tactical flexibility when standardization and training create predictable patterns? How do you empower frontline operators to innovate while maintaining coordinated operations? How do you adapt faster than opponents can counter-adapt? The answers aren't simple. But England's patrol provides a case study in getting it right. A highly trained crew, leaders who trusted their people, operators who understood their systems deeply enough to see beyond official doctrine, and, crucially, the willingness to try something new when circumstances demanded it. The 6 Japanese submarines that England sank represented hundreds of trained crew members, years of submarine construction, and irreplaceable operational experience. But the strategic impact went beyond those material losses. The submarine picket line was supposed to provide early warning of American fleet movements. Without that warning, Japanese naval forces fought at a severe disadvantage during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That battle, in turn, crippled Japanese naval aviation so severely that Japan could never again mount effective carrier operations. The loss of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam gave American forces airfields within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. B-29 super fortresses flying from those islands would eventually drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's impossible to draw a direct causal line from John Prock's sonar technique to the end of the war. History is too complex, too multivariate, but it's clear that England's patrol had consequences far beyond 6 submarine kills. When those submarines failed to report, when Admiral Toyoda's operation proceeded without intelligence, when the resulting battle became a disaster, the course of the Pacific War shifted measurably. This is the nature of tactical innovation. Small advantages, properly exploited, cascade into larger effects. A sonar operator who thinks differently about how to track submarines enables a ship to achieve unprecedented success. That success eliminates an enemy picket line. The missing picket line enables a decisive battle victory. The battle victory enables island captures. The island captures enable strategic bombing, links in a chain, each necessary, none sufficient alone. The commemorations of England's achievement focused understandably on the ship and her commanding officers. The Presidential Unit citation praised the entire crew's performance. Admiral King's promise ensured the ship's name would never be forgotten. But in the technical details, in the tactical analysis, in the sonar operators' training manuals that incorporated lessons from the patrol, John Prock's contribution is recorded. A soundman from Indiana who figured out that sometimes the best way to track a submarine was to make it think you weren't tracking it at all. His innovation didn't require new technology. It didn't require more resources. It required only a willingness to question assumptions and think about problems differently. The evening of May 31st, 1944, as USS England secured from general quarters after sinking RO-105, the crew was exhausted. 12 days of continuous operations, 6 submarine kills, hundreds of hours at battle stations. The sonar operators in particular had been pushed to their limits, maintaining concentration hour after hour, listening to echoes through headphones, distinguishing real targets from false contacts, tracking submarines through evasive maneuvers in darkness and rough seas. It was mentally and physically draining work. But they'd proven something important. They'd proven that human skill, when combined with adequate technology and tactical innovation, could achieve extraordinary results. They'd proven that anti-submarine warfare was as much art as science, requiring intuition and creativity alongside technical proficiency. And they'd proven that unconventional thinking, when properly applied, could turn impossible odds into decisive victories. The submarines didn't stand a chance, not because American technology was overwhelmingly superior. Japanese submarines were well-designed, capable vessels, not because American sailors were inherently better. Japanese submarine crews were experienced and skilled. The submarines didn't stand a chance because they faced opponents who'd learned to think differently about submarine hunting, who'd questioned established doctrine, who'd recognized that predictability was a vulnerability and unpredictability a weapon, who'd figured out that in the deadly game of hunter and hunted, the greatest advantage came not from better equipment, but from better thinking about how to use the equipment you had. The water north of the Admiralty Islands is deep and dark. Somewhere far below the surface, the wrecks of 6 Japanese submarines rest on the seafloor. RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-116, and I-16, 318 crew members who never returned home. They were doing their duty, following orders, serving their nation as they'd sworn to do. In the cold mathematics of war, they became statistics. 6 submarines sunk, 1 patrol line eliminated, 1 strategic operation disrupted. But each submarine was a crew of men. Each crew member had a name, a family, a life interrupted and ended in darkness and crushing pressure as their boats broke apart around them. This was the cost of tactical innovation. This was the price of John Prock figuring out how to make sonar more effective. This was the consequence of USS England achieving unprecedented success in anti-submarine warfare. War keeps its terrible accounting in human lives. The tactical brilliance, the technical innovation, the unprecedented achievement, none of it changes the fundamental reality that 58 men died aboard RO-108, 55 aboard RO-105, 56 aboard RO-116. Each death was a tragedy. Each submarine's sinking was a story of men fighting for survival in an environment that offered no mercy. The sonar operators who hunted them, the commanding officers who directed the attacks, the crews who loaded and fired the hedgehogs, they were doing their duty as well. They were protecting their own ships, their own fleet, their own nation's interests. They took no pleasure in killing, but they understood that in total war, hesitation meant their own deaths. The submarines they sank would have attacked American carriers, transports, supply ships, would have killed American sailors. The mathematics was brutal and inescapable. Kill or be killed, hunt or be hunted, innovate or die. This is what makes John Prock's story both remarkable and troubling. He found a way to make submarine hunting more effective, which meant he found a way to kill more submarine crews. It was necessary. It was his duty. It contributed to American victory in the Pacific War. But the innovation that made him notable was fundamentally about making death more efficient. This paradox sits at the heart of military innovation. The same creativity, intelligence, and problem-solving ability that in peacetime might cure diseases or design bridges, in wartime turns toward finding better ways to destroy the enemy. The same tactical empathy that let Prock understand what submarine commanders would do, that let him turn their training against them, required thinking of those commanders as opponents to be defeated, not as fellow human beings. There's no comfortable resolution to this paradox. War demands it. Peace would render it unnecessary. The men and women who serve in militaries live with this tension as an occupational hazard. When the war ended, John Prock returned to civilian life. Whatever he'd learned about hunting submarines in darkness, whatever psychological weight he carried from those 12 days in May 1944, he carried privately. The Navy had no use for submarine hunting skills in peacetime Indiana. The techniques he'd pioneered continued to be taught in training schools, continued to be refined by subsequent generations of sonar operators. But Prock himself moved. On, his war was over. The legacy of England's patrol extends beyond tactics and technology into the realm of institutional culture. The Navy learned that tactical innovation often came from unexpected sources, that enlisted personnel could solve problems officers couldn't, that rigid adherence to doctrine could be counterproductive, that empowering skilled operators to experiment and adapt paid enormous dividends. These lessons were codified into training programs, into officer development courses, into the institutional knowledge that shaped how the Navy approached anti-submarine warfare for decades. The culture of continuous improvement, of learning from frontline experience, of respecting technical expertise regardless of rank. This culture can be traced in part to examples like England's patrol, where an enlisted sonar operator's innovation changed the outcome of operations. Modern naval warfare has evolved beyond recognition from 1944. Nuclear submarines can remain submerged for months. Passive sonar arrays can detect targets hundreds of miles away. Computers process acoustic data that human operators could never analyze unaided. Satellite surveillance, unmanned underwater vehicles, and artificial intelligence have transformed submarine detection. Yet, the fundamental dynamic remains. Submarines try to hide. Anti-submarine forces try to find them. Both sides innovate. Both sides adapt. Both sides study each other's capabilities and look for vulnerabilities to exploit. The technological specifics change. The underlying pattern continues, and at the heart of that pattern, human judgment still matters. Operators who understand their systems deeply enough to see beyond programmed responses, commanders who trust their people enough to let them innovate, strategists who recognize that yesterday's tactics may not work tomorrow. The skills that made John Prock effective in 1944, tactical empathy, creative problem-solving, willingness to question doctrine, remain valuable. The specific application changes with technology, but the underlying cognitive abilities transfer across eras. In the darkness, before dawn, on May 24th, 1944, a young soundman pressed his headphones tight and listened to the ocean. Through hundreds of feet of water, through layers of varying temperature and pressure, through the ambient noise of wind and waves and his own ship's machinery, he heard the faint, rhythmic thrum of a submarine's propellers. He'd heard that sound before, he'd tracked it, lost it, tracked it again. But this time, he had an idea, a trick that defied training, that inverted doctrine, that turned the enemy's expectations into a weapon. Lieutenant Williamson listened to Prock's explanation, nodded, gave permission to try. England came around for another run. Prock slowed his ping rate, making it seem like contact was fading. The submarine commander, hearing the change, steadied his course. Just for a moment, hedgehogs arced into darkness. Projectiles sank through black water. 300 feet down, they struck steel. The submarine broke apart. 56 men died. The picket line was breached. The operation failed. The battle was lost. The war moved inexorably toward its conclusion, all because a sonar operator figured out that sometimes the best way to catch a submarine was to make it think you'd stopped hunting. This was how modern anti-submarine warfare was born, not in strategic planning sessions or engineering laboratories, but in the sonar station of a small destroyer escort in the Pacific darkness. One sailor, one idea, one moment of inspiration that changed everything. The ocean keeps its secrets. The submarines rest on the seafloor, their stories entombed in steel. But the lessons learned from their destruction echo through the decades. Innovation matters, trust matters, creative thinking matters. The willingness to question assumptions and try new approaches matters. John Prock's impossible sonar trick proved that in the deadliest game imaginable, sometimes the greatest weapon isn't more technology or more firepower. Sometimes it's just better thinking about how to use what you already have. The submarine commanders who died in those dark waters never knew what killed them, never understood that their training had been turned into a trap, never realized that the sonar pulses slowing meant danger was imminent, not receding. They died, believing they'd evaded successfully. Died in the moment before hedgehogs struck. Died, never knowing that a soundman from Indiana had figured out how to hunt submarines in total darkness. The darkness that had always been the submarine's greatest ally had become a killing field. All because one sailor asked a simple question. What if we did the opposite of what they expect? What if we made them think we'd lost them? What if we used their training against them? Simple questions, devastating answers. That was the trick that turned destroyers into perfect predators in total darkness. That was the innovation that helped win the war beneath the waves. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.